now we'll move to the Q&A session. So Sarah, I have collected some of the questions, some of the relevant questions from the audiences, and I'll be putting up for you to answer. So we'll start with the first question. So the first question is on the particle size distribution. It is interesting to note that one can synthesize a wide range of shapes by simply changing the pH and tuning growth rate. Have you observed any Ostwald ripening at higher or lower pH affecting the particle size distribution?
Yeah, so there is a very narrow pH range in which you can get high quality nanocrystals, in particular at very high pH. The deposition becomes largely uncontrolled. You may even observe homogeneous nucleation and growth in addition to the seeded growth, and so you end up with very bad samples. But there's a narrow window where you can get quite beautiful structures. But at the extremes, things kind of go crazy.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Moving on to the next questions relating to the particle size only, I can see in the seed mediated growth, if the reaction is allowed to continue for a long time, would the final structure assume the most stable equilibrium shape?
So what we have found is that the structures are quite stable. So if you let it just sit in the growth solution for a very long time, you really don't see any changes from the structures that I've shown you. And so I think that is indicative of them truly being kinetically trapped, because we do know from those heating studies that if you do heat them, they will start to deform, and eventually they'll evolve into a more quasi-spherical morphology. So I think the reason why they are, why they stay the way they are is just that that we are really and truly trapping kinetic structures.
Okay. So moving on to the next question we have, can we use the metal nanocrystal methods to synthesize the zinc oxide and titanium oxide nanoparticles? And what approach we should take to maintain a lower toxicity of these metal oxide nanoparticles for the skincare applications as UV absorbers?
Yeah, so there are some differences between our system and the synthesis of zinc oxide and titania, particularly because you're ultimately, these are binary compositions where you have, and they're not metallic structures, they're ionic structures. So that definitely influences what is possible. But some of the bigger themes hold as, I think, standards. So for example, if you start with seeds of a particular symmetry that are zinc oxide, then your resulting nanocrystals will likely adopt the same symmetry. Likewise, changes in kinetics will give you potentially different shapes for zinc oxide or titania. And there are very nice examples of that in the literature. But you may not be able to access, for example, the exact, like, for example, branched titania particles at high deposition kinetics, because the wetting of your depositing material on the seeds is quite a different process because of it being an ionic compound. So some of the ideas extend, but how you achieve them will vary quite a bit. In terms of the toxicity of metal oxides, I honestly don't know a whole lot about the overall toxicity, other than that with zinc oxide and titania, there isn't huge concerns about their toxicity, at least on skin. because of their wide use um, in um, um, in the sunscreen applications. But I do think that there is some dependence on particle size, and often in the sunscreen applications, they call them nano particles when they're actually not nanoparticles. They're more micron size particles. And so I do think that there is likely some need to have pay closer attention to what happens at extremely small sizes, and whether there are any health risks that's more just inherent to very small sizes. For example, there are concerns about inhalation of extremely small particles and what that could do. And so I don't think that many people have really done an extremely careful examination of that kind of toxicity.
Sure. Uh, Thank you, Sarah. We have another question on the application aspect. So, are these engineered crystals used in industrial scale catalysis applications?
What was the question again?
So, are these engineered crystals used in industrial scale catalysis applications?
Ah, so these particular nanocrystals that I've shown in this presentation, they're quite large. They're often 50 to 100 nanometers in edge length. And so I would not recommend them for industrial scale catalysis because it's still a pretty inefficient use of very precious metals. However, my research group does work in the area of catalysis, and we have been using the seed-mediated co-reduction approach to make alloyed nanoparticles in the 10 nanometer to sub 10 nanometer regime with some very interesting results. It's less focused on shape control and more focused on compositional control and strain engineering. And so I think that those nanocrystals could potentially be used in catalysis, large scale catalysis, because they're much smaller, and at that size regime, you're using your precious materials in a much more efficient manner. A current challenge is how do you scale up these types of syntheses? And so we're not quite there yet in terms of scale up, but we have been working as a group to come up with continuous flow routes towards nanomaterials, making nanomaterials either in micro droplet reactors or in aerosol phase or aerosol droplets. And in the micro droplet reactors, we have been able to make core shell particles, shape controlled particles. So I think it's just a matter of time before we can address the scale issues.
Yeah. Uh, Next question we have is which plane is favorable for crystal growth of gold on palladium?
Um, so that's where it really is going to depend on a lot of different parameters. So I can't answer that with a definitive, this is going to always be favorable. You have to consider what capping agents are present in solution, what solvent you're in, what the deposition kinetics are, and all of that's going to influence what surface is going to be preferable.
Okay, sure. Then we have uh, how to ensure bimetallic core shell structure with metals having widely varying work functions are workable.
Trying to find the question.
Yeah,
Um,
how to ensure bimetallic core shell structures with metals having widely varying work functions are workable.
yeah, so this is one thing that we're very interested in, is trying to move beyond the gold palladium system. And I initially thought that it would be quite uh, straightforward to add different metals into the system, but you're actually limited by your initial solvent system and capping agent system. So we use CTAB and water and ascorbic acid, and that's a pretty classic system. And you end up with, you can add in a few different metals, other metals, for example, silver is okay, platinum is okay. But when you start to move to less noble metals, they are so susceptible to oxidation that really the water system doesn't work well. So we have then moved into organic phase, and there we can end up with much greater compositional versatility, and access a lot of other compositions. But usually you're having to use high temperature conditions to thermally decompose your metal complexes or precursors that you're using. And that results in very fast surface diffusion once the metal adds onto the seeds. And so getting kinetic structures becomes more challenging in the organic media. And so you often just end up with quasi-spherical structures. So we're trying to figure out a way to sort of marry these two different approaches, and so that we can access things made out of nanomaterials made out of non-noble metals, but also kinetic structures. So that's really I think a frontier for this kind of work.
So, Sarah, we have another question. What could be the reason for such a dramatic change in the thermal stability of gold nanoparticles by simply changing the shape?
So in changing the shape, some of it the morphology stability can depend on, for example, the radius of curvature of different features. So with our branched nanocrystals, for example, the tips have a very small radius of curvature. And so that is a very high energy feature. And so when you add heat, the atoms in those positions are more likely to diffuse to adopt a more thermodynamically favored position. However, if you are starting with a structure that's already doesn't have those kind of features, the atoms are already more stable, and so you'd have to put in more energy to get them to be able for them to move towards the more thermodynamically favored position.
Yeah, in relation to that question only, I'm having one more. In the photothermal conversion, the heating effect that you observe is due to gold alone, or is there a contribution from palladium?
There is a contribution from palladium in the photothermal conversion. It actually is a rather complex relationship, because the overall photothermal efficiency is going to depend heavily on how the palladium is mixed or distributed in the nanostructure. And so I don't have a very concise way of outlining that, but I would draw people's attention to the particular paper, because it goes through it quite nicely. It's the top paper on this slide in nanoscale from 2019. In this particular paper, Chris Kutner undertook a lot of computational work to really tease out how the palladium should be distributed to achieve high photothermal conversion rates while also preserving stability. And so he looked at core shell structures, alloyed structures, and a variety of other loadings of palladium. So I would draw your attention here if it's something you really want to get into the finer details, because it's not a, it definitely does this. It depends on the distribution.
So thank you, Sarah. I think we are coming to the end of this session. So in the interest of time, I'll just take the last question. So have you checked the catalytic activity of this bimetallic systems in organic transformations, such as selective coupling?
No, we have not. We did one quick study looking at the gold palladium structures for some electrocatalysis processes, and they were, they facilitated the reaction, but they, when you normalized for surface area, they were not, or when you normalized by mass, they were not very good materials because so much of the materials in the interior. But we haven't looked at it for any organic transformations.